In 1981, the then largely unknown author Thomas Harris published his sophomore novel Red Dragon about the serial-killing cannibal psychiatrist and case study in normative determinism, Hannibal Lecter.
Hannibal the cannibal. That is what they'll call him, you know.
Red Dragon follows Will Graham, an FBI agent who retires after being badly injured while apprehending Lecter. Picking up after a grisly series of home invasion murders, Graham is pulled back into the FBI to catch the Red Dragon and visits Lecter in his cell to obtain his help. The follow-up novel, The Silence of the Lambs, was published in 1988. Silence picks up 3 years after Red Dragon, when trainee FBI agent Clarice Starling is tasked with interviewing Lecter after a series of unsolved murders, and ends up working with him to catch the serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. 3 years later, The Silence of the Lambs was adapted to screen in what is widely considered to be one of the best thriller films ever made, introducing Hannibal Lecter to the world at large. Harris's final book in the trilogy, simply titled Hannibal, was published in 1999 and also adapted to film in short order. The series' conclusion sees Clarice become involved in the international effort to recapture and escape Lecter. The prequel film, Red Dragon, would flesh out the trilogy in 2002, telling the story of Hannibal Lecter, Will Graham, and the Great Red Dragon. This relationship would again be at the focus in 2013, when a new adaptation appeared in the form of the NBC television series Hannibal. This series has served as a starting point to a new generation of fans, introducing many to the franchise and the character of Hannibal Lecter. Across its many iterations, the Hannibal franchise has contained multiple explicit and implicit representations of queer people, most of which have been widely considered to be problematic at best. From playing into the pathologizing of LGBT people, to the persistent issue of queer coding its villains, to the relatively minor offense of outdated terminology, the Hannibal franchise paints an image of queer people that is, overall, negative, controversial, and awkward. This analysis will center on 4 main characters from the franchise, and examine how their characterization and roles reflect broader tropes and biases in the media about queerness and queer people. Buffalo Bill, Mason Verger, Margot Verger, and Hannibal Lecter himself. Each of these characters are either coded as or explicitly queer, depending on the iteration, and each employ different tropes and narratives around queerness in their characterization. Appearing in only one iteration of the franchise, James Gumb, or Buffalo Bill, has become something of a cultural touchstone.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
This very memorable character has also sparked controversy, starting almost immediately after Silence's release. Looking at the character, it's not difficult to see why. Gumb has, in canon, applied for and been denied gender confirmation surgery 3 times. He's had at least one relationship with a man and is seen wearing makeup and women's clothes. Less explicitly, he embodies other stereotypes of queer people in his mannerisms and interests. He also kidnaps and kills women to make a suit out of their skin. Buffalo Bill is the embodiment of the worst, most harmful, and bigoted ideas about transgender women. Namely, that transgender women are sexual fetishists and predators, envious of cisgender women, and violent towards them. This characterization lines up with one particularly venomous narrative about transgender women, pioneered by sexologist Ray Blanchard in the 1980s. In short, Blanchard's theory argues that trans women are not, as many describe themselves, essentially female spirits wrongly born into male bodies, but are either effeminate gay men trying to court straight men, or straight men with a sexual fetish for the idea of becoming women. Blanchard bases his theory largely on a single case study, relying on select anecdotes instead of statistics to form a conclusion about an entire population group. Suffice it to say, I remain unconvinced. Blanchard's typology used to be a fringe theory, but has been gaining traction in recent years, slowly creeping into the mainstream discourse around issues like transgender athletes and which public bathroom trans people should use. More recently, J.K. Rowling published a book featuring a male serial killer dressing up in women's clothing to commit murders, which has sparked mass controversy for playing into the idea of trans people being villains. The Silence of the Lambs might be the most famous example of this trope, but it appears time and time again in the horror and thriller genres.
Self-satirical, Leatherface has a lot in common with the gender-bending killer in The Silence of the Lambs.
In one memorable scene, Buffalo Bill dances in front of a mirror, wearing the scalp of one of his victims, while his captive screams for help in the background. Yet, the most memorable element of the scene is Gumm's feminine presentation, the gender variance portrayed as more shocking than the extreme violence. This is reminiscent of the final scene in Sleepaway Camp, where the shock is not the reveal that the protagonist of the film was the killer all along, but that she was designated male at birth.
God, she's a boy.
Psycho, Sleepaway Camp, Dressed to Kill, The Crying Game, and yes, The Silence of the Lambs. These are just some examples of films that portray not only a correlation between gender variance and violence, but where gender identity or presentation is directly causational as well.
If looks could kill, he wouldn't need a chainsaw.
In many of these films, the villain's psychosis and gender variance results from childhood trauma or is a symptom of mental illness. Boys with overbearing and abusive mothers, forced to dress and behave as girls, violently lashing out at women in adulthood. Killers with a split personality, one male and one female, a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde. These are not simply killers who just happen to be gender variant, they are very specifically gender variant killers. Transness, yet again, is shown to be inextricably tied to monstrousness, as both the inspiration for and explanation of a murder. Of course, not everyone agrees. One popular article defending the characterization of Buffalo Bill essentially argues that Buffalo Bill can't be a transmisogynistic representation because Buffalo Bill is not trans. As evidence, it refers to one specific line from the film.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
This argument is a weak attempt to sidestep the real issue by invoking a technicality. Violent transmisogynists do not care, and likely do not understand, the difference between a transgender woman, a crossdresser, or any other visibly gender variant person. Hyperfixating on these distinctions is a largely theoretical, academic exercise which ignores the real-world implications of propagating negative narratives around LGBT people. The reality is that transgender people are orders of magnitude more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators. Trans women face a drastically higher rate of violence, sexual violence, and murder than the general population. Since January 2013, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation has recorded at least 157 transgender and gender nonconforming individuals who are victims of fatal violence in the United States. I will concede to one point. Buffalo Bill is not really transgender, because Buffalo Bill is not really anything. He is a fictional character, constructed by an author, to fill a role in a particular narrative. It's therefore pointless to consider these characters in terms of their own psychology, as what really matters is what they represent in the story, and what messages this propagates. Of all the killers featured across the franchise, Mason Verger is perhaps the most immediately repulsive. As Jeff Casey states in Queer Cannibals and Deviant Detectives, while all of the murderers and villains in the Lecter novels are disfigured, trauma survivors, or are coded in some way as sexually deviant, the most villainous figure in all of Harris's novels is probably Mason Verger. A sadistic, disfigured, murderous pedophile who drinks martinis made with children's tears, Mason Verger is a caricature of the worst elements of criminal behavior, almost operatic in the excess of his cruelty. It is not a subtle characterization. Mason's physical appearance is equally disturbing. Like a pale spider crab, the hand moves. The goggle over his single eye makes a tiny hiss as it sprays moisture on his lidless eyeball. Mason Verger, noseless and lipless, with no soft tissue on his face, was all teeth, like a creature of the deep, deep ocean. Shock comes with the recognition that this is a human face with a mind behind it. Harris's choice of language paints an image of Verger that is monstrous, inhuman, subhuman. It's hard to argue that Mason doesn't deserve such a description, but it's worth asking why Harris decided to write such a repulsive figure as a queer man in the first place. Mason Verger, dreadful as he is not a real person. As I mentioned with regard to Buffalo Bill, thinking of fictional characters as real people and trying to rationalize their actions and motives as such is a common trap in media criticism. Mason has victimized male and female children, but it is his homosexual predatory behavior that is most emphasized. He also once attempted to seduce Hannibal before his disfigurement. His characterization by Harris is an example of the societal fear of predatory gay and bisexual men. It exists in the context of decades, even centuries of homophobic oppression and unfair suspicion of queer men. Historically, queer sexuality, psychiatric illness, and other modes of social deviancy became inextricably entwined. This conflation of violence and queerness is and has been reflected in the media, dating back to the 1934 Hays Code, which mandated that no sexually deviant characters be shown in a sympathetic light. The shadow of the code still falls over the Hannibal franchise. As Casey bluntly puts it, Thomas Harris's novels, and to a lesser extent the film adaptations, are quite homophobic and transphobic. They also participate in the conflation of queerness, disability, and criminal violence. Mason might be the most extreme example in the series, but you don't have to look far to find another. Margot Verger, Mason's sister, offers a different example of how queerness can be pathologized. Margot is a lesbian, one of the few explicitly queer characters in the original trilogy. Unfortunately, in line with the general trend established, her portrayal in the book leaves much to be desired. The novel suggests that Margot is a lesbian not because it's her native sexual orientation, but as a result of Mason's abuse toward her. This reduces and pathologizes her sexual orientation as a symptom of trauma, and calls to mind destructive narratives around there being a cause, or even a cure, for homosexuality. As described by showrunner Bryan Fuller, the book version of Margot is a very masculine character who has had years of steroid abuse and is a lesbian, and it was unclear whether she was either transgender or a lesbian as a result of those horrible abuses and that horrible childhood. In the television series, she is portrayed by Katharine Isabelle, an actress who bears little physical resemblance to Margot's description in the book, to put it lightly. Her television counterpart is much more feminine, conventionally attractive, and more in line with the typical representation of lesbians on television. Margot is also omitted entirely from the Hannibal film, which also had to adapt the plot to incorporate Mason's death without Margot killing him. Margot's absence as a butch lesbian in the film and series is one example of the erasure of gender non-conforming people in visual media. There is a sort of tax of masculinity or femininity that gay or lesbian characters, respectively, must pay to be shown on screen. They are allowed, so long as they are appropriately conformist, lest they become the butt of a joke predicated on gay stereotypes. These sorts of respectability politics have a painful history for gender non-conforming LGBT people, many of who have been specifically targeted for being the wrong type of gay. While all LGBT people have suffered to some extent under the same bigotry, not all gay people were targeted equally. Drag queens and butch lesbians faced extreme police harassment and public persecution, while straight-passing gay people were able to effectively acquire some of the privileges of heterosexuality. Considering the historical and current treatment of acceptable versus unacceptable levels of conformity for LGBT people, it is disappointing that Bryan Fuller, himself a gay man, would uphold the standard of lesbian characters on television, often being very feminine and generally unobtrusive, in addition to other negative tropes. A review of the representation of queer women in film and television reveals that there are three major tropes that they fall into: dead, evil, and pregnant. The all lesbians want kids trope, as it's known, is a relatively new development. The trope usually involves an established lesbian couple who attempt to acquire sperm to have a child through desperate means that rarely involve the proper channels.
There is something I need to get from Mason before he goes to prison. Any experience harvesting sperm?
In Margot's case, her reason for wanting a child is a bit more complicated. A clause in her wealthy father's will means that Margot needs a biological Verger heir or face destitution when Mason dies. Her desperation is explained by her unique situation, but the effect is still the same. In one of the few instances of the TV series being more objectionable than the source material, Margot sleeps with a man under false pretenses with the goal of getting pregnant. Not only is this troubling on its face, it also suggests a deceitfulness and detached, almost Machiavellian practicality to her character. However, it must be acknowledged that Margot is very different from Mason in this regard. She does commit murder, but with very good reason, and is generally written as sympathetic, even heroic in certain moments. To give credit where it's due, Hannibal does avoid the most well-known and controversial trope associated with queer women: their death. A comprehensive infographic catalogues the fates of all queer female characters on television since 1976, revealing that 31% died and only 10% had a happy ending. Considering the show's overall high mortality rate, it could be understandable if either Margot or her partner Alana died. Instead, things turn out quite well for them comparatively. Although they are forced on the run after Hannibal's escape, they are married, rich, and alive. As Margot's characterization demonstrates, the NBC series' portrayal of LGBT characters is more complicated than simply good or bad. The series deviates from the source material in several ways, often adding layers of nuance and depth to characters and relationships that were originally more simplistic. When considering the adaptational changes from the source material, specifically in regard to LGBT representation, it is impossible to avoid discussing how the series portrays the relationship between Hannibal and Will Graham. The relationship between Will and Hannibal is the emotional heart and central conflict of the show. Starting from relatively flat source material, NBC Hannibal creates one of the most complex and fascinating queer relationships on network TV. Hannibal is not a direct adaptation or a remake. Rather, it's best thought of as something of a remix, rearranging elements from the source material with only key plot points matching up. Some adaptational changes include making Freddie Lounds a woman, casting Jack Crawford as a black man, and portraying Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham as gay lovers. Let me explain. Hannibal Lecter is and always has been coded as queer. He is foreign, rich, intellectual, and artistic. He cares too much about his clothing and personal appearance. All of these traits, even Hannibal's foreign accent, have traditionally coded white male characters as homosexual in American cinema.
I always figured him for queer. All this artsy-fartsy stuff.
In the television series, this is only amplified. Reflecting the Clarice-Hannibal relationship, Will and Hannibal's relationship begins as a sort of mentorship, with Hannibal the first to try and initiate a friendship.
God forbid we become friendly.
I don't find you that interesting.
You will.
During the first season, they become closer. When Hannibal becomes Will's unofficial psychiatrist and Will begins to open up, they speak to each other more or less honestly. It's clear that Hannibal has some genuine affection toward Will, as he discusses with his psychiatrist.
I miss him.
You are obsessed with Will Graham.
The 2015 article, Queer Cannibals and Deviant Detectives, examines the deadly bromance that unfolds between Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter, exploring the romantic tension between the two in the first 2 seasons.
Did you just smell me?
Difficult to avoid.
After Will kills the serial killer father of Abigail Hobbs, he and Hannibal take on almost paternal roles, forming a pseudo-familial unit.
Feeling paternal, Will?
Aren't you?
Yes. We are fathers now.
I will not belabor the obviously gay implications here. However, what Hannibal and Will have is far from domestic bliss. As Will's mental state declines, his misplaced trust in Lecter leads him down a path that sees him arrested and tried for Hannibal's crimes, the first season ending with a potent reversal of an iconic scene.
Hello, Dr. Lecter.
With his incarceration, the relationship turns hostile. After Will is exonerated, but before Hannibal is found out, Will constructs a secret plan with Jack Crawford to catch Hannibal in the act. As part of the plan, Will allows Hannibal to believe that he is still under his control. For most of the season, however, the audience is also unaware of this, and believes as Hannibal does that Will is succumbing to his influence. It becomes increasingly uncertain which side Will is really on, perhaps even to Will himself. The reveal that Will has been working as a double agent is quickly undercut by the suggestion that he has truly grown closer to Lecter, developing a loyalty for him. In the season 2 finale, when Will and Jack had planned to finally catch Lecter, Will appears to have a change of heart and calls Hannibal to let him know he's walking into a trap. What follows can only be described as a bloodbath. The final confrontation between Will and Hannibal in this scene, where Hannibal expresses his genuine hurt at Will's betrayal, as well as his genuine hope for their future together, is one of the most emotionally potent scenes in the show. From the close physical proximity, to the music, to the long lingering looks and pervasive sense of tenderness, even as Hannibal stabs Will, the scene reads as undoubtedly romantic. Season 3 opens with Bedelia and Hannibal masquerading as husband and wife in Italy. Bedelia is aware of Hannibal's true nature, but even then is unable to truly connect with him the way Will has.
But you are wearing a very well-tailored person suit.
The next episode reveals that Will did survive the massacre, but only because Hannibal wanted him to. Even amid his betrayal, Hannibal still chooses to save Will. Later, in a direct parallel between Clarice and Will, Hannibal bridal carries Will out of the Verger mansion after rescuing him. When the two first reunite in Europe, they regard each other in close-shot reverse shots, while exchanging dialogues that, in isolation, are romantic almost to the point of cliché.
If I saw you every day, forever, I would remember this time.
Strange seeing you here in front of me.
If the first 2 seasons contained homoerotic subtext, then Season 3 crosses the boundary into text. So explicit is it, in fact, that the author of the original Queer Cannibals article published a follow-up, in which he reflects that his initial reading was downright naive in retrospect.
Is Hannibal in love with me?
Yes.
Despite these heavily romance-coded interactions, however, the show refuses to outright confirm any such relationship. As Fuller says, Will Graham is very definitely heterosexual, but that does not necessarily prevent us from a homoerotic subtext. For his part, Hannibal has 2 female love interests throughout the show. Yet, his relationships with Alana Bloom and Bedelia du Maurier never reach the same level of emotional intimacy as with Will Graham. Will has his own female love interests, but again, the most significant relationship in his life is to Hannibal. During the time jump in the middle of Season 3, Will gets married. However, when he returns to the FBI, it's easy to forget he has a wife and child, especially in the scenes he shares with Hannibal, and they are nowhere to be seen in the series' emotional climax. The show's final scene serves as the perfect culmination to this complex, tumultuous relationship. The final song, Love Crime, was written specifically for the scene, with lyrics that directly reflect Hannibal and Will's relationship. After killing the Red Dragon, Will reflects that the blood really does look black in the moonlight, a callback to an earlier line from Hannibal, symbolizing that Will has completed his journey from innocent to killer, as Hannibal always intended him to. From the beginning, Hannibal revels in the uncertain nature of the relationship, which edges ever closer toward a romantic and sexual attraction without ever falling over the cliff. In the final scene, Hannibal and Will grapple at each other on a ledge, incredibly close, and it seems for a moment that a kiss is inevitable. Instead, Will grabs Hannibal and pulls them both, together, over the edge. In reviewing these 4 characters across multiple iterations, it's clear that the Hannibal franchise has a complicated relationship with LGBT characters and fans. The tropes and stereotypes employed are often questionable, playing directly into harmful narratives around LGBT people that can have dangerous, real-world implications. The infamous serial killer Buffalo Bill embodies many of the most bigoted and harmful ideas about transgender women. Mason Verger, primary antagonist in 3 iterations of the franchise, is a pedophile who targets young boys, an example of the societal fear of predatory gay and bisexual men. Certain readings also support the implication that his sister, lesbian bodybuilder Margot Verger, became a lesbian due to her brother's childhood sexual abuse toward her, and her physical appearance on screen drastically departs from her original description, in another example of the erasure of gender nonconforming people. Some of these issues are remedied in the NBC series, but it's still far from perfect. The central relationship between Hannibal and Will is truly deeply unhealthy.
You called us murder husbands.
You did run off to Europe together.
And is never even confirmed in the series, drawing some accusations of queerbaiting from its audience. Despite this, many LGBT viewers, myself included, seem to be perpetually drawn toward a franchise that should, on its face, repel them. Whether it be due to desperation from a general lack of representation, a reclamation of negative stereotypes as protest, some masochistic urge, or a simple appreciation for good storytelling, one thing remains the same: We will see what we want to see.
See?